When the nurse told me my surgery had been delayed because my son hadn't paid a deposit, I didn't argue, I didn't protest. I just stared at the empty chair by the window and realized he had decided my life wasn't worth the price of saving. That was the moment it sank in, the moment the truth ripped through me sharper than any scalpel could, and though the monitors beside my bed kept beeping as if everything was fine, I knew something had broken inside me, something that would never heal the same way again. The room smelled of antiseptic and loneliness. The blinds cut the light into cruel stripes across the floor, and while the hospital staff busied themselves with forms and procedures, all I could think about was that my own blood, my own son, had measured my worth in dollars and come up short. The nurse shifted uneasily, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished linoleum as she tried to explain that these things happen sometimes. Her voice soft, professional, as though she had said the same words other abandoned parents, other unwanted patients left to wait, to fade, to be written off like uncollected debts. But I barely heard her because the echo of my son's voice from the week before kept replaying in my head, his tone impatient, clipped, dismissive. "Dad, you're old. The doctors say the surgery might not even help. I don't see the point of spending so much money when there are other priorities." Other priorities. I mouthed the words silently as if tasting poison. For him, his wife's new car was a priority. The family vacation they had just posted about online was a priority. The kitchen renovation with marble countertops and imported tiles was a priority. My life, the years I had given to him, the roof I had built over his head, the school fees I had scraped together, so he could have opportunities one never did. Those were not priorities. Those were disposable, optional, unworthy of investment. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me felt louder the longer I sat there, each buzz and flicker mocking me with its steadiness, as if the very infrastructure of the hospital could endure more faithfully than my own child's loyalty. I turned my head toward the window where the winter sky hung low and gray, the glass cold against the back of my hand as I rested it there, and I thought about how many times I had stood in the rain waiting for him to finish football practice, how many winters I had shoveled snow just to clear the path to his first car, how many late nights I had walked into this very hospital years ago when he broke his wrist and needed me by his side, no matter what the bill was, no matter what sacrifices I had to make. And now, when it was my turn to need him, he was gone, his absence as loud as the beeping machines, as heavy as the weight pressing against my chest. And yet somewhere inside me, beneath the shock, beneath the ache, a new kind of strength began to coil, cold and steady, like steel being forged. Because if he thought he could scar me like a piece of worn-out furniture, if he thought my silence would mean surrender, then he had forgotten who I was. He had forgotten the hands that built his world, the man who had raised him, the father who had given him everything. I pressed the button on the side of the bed to raise myself slightly, my back aching as a motor whirred, and the nurse adjusted the four-line with gentle hands, her face kind but careful, the way people look at someone they fear might break. "Would you like me to call anyone else for you?" she asked softly. Anyone else? The word stung because the truth was there was no one else. My wife was gone, buried years ago, taken by an illness that hollowed out my world long before today. And my son was all I had left, or so I had thought. But in that moment, staring at the blank wall where his face had been, I realized the cruelest part wasn't the absence of family. It was a discovery that family could choose absence, that the people you had loved most could decide you were no longer worth the trouble. I closed my eyes, pretending to rest, but behind my eyelids I saw his smirk, his careless shrug, the way he had brushed me off when I asked if he'd spoken to the doctor about the costs. "Dad, stop worrying. Everything will be fine," he had said, and I wanted to believe him because that's what fathers do. They believe in their children, even when the children stop believing in them. Now I saw the lie for what it was. A placeholder, a convenient phrase to keep me quiet while he planned his escape. Minutes dragged into hours, the clock on the wall ticking too loud. Each second another reminder of time wasted, of breath borrowed, of loyalty betrayed. Nurses came and went, adjusting machines, offering water, checking vitals. But the chair by the window stayed empty, and I stayed silent, because there was no point in asking anymore. The truth was already clear. But silence is not surrender. Silence can be a seed, and as I lay there in that sterile room, humiliated and discarded, a plan began to take root. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not let this betrayal be the last word in my story. If my son believed I was powerless, he was about to learn that there are few forces stronger than a wounded man with nothing left to lose, nothing except the hunger to reclaim his dignity, to carve justice out of the cruelty he had been dealt. The hospital's intercom crackled overhead with announcements, codes, and room numbers echoing down the halls, and I thought how anonymous it all felt, how patients came and went, lives balanced on the edge, decisions made in quiet offices with folders and pens. And yet, for me, this wasn't just about life or death. It was about betrayal, about what it meant to be cast aside like an unpaid bill. And betrayal has consequences. So I kept my eyes closed, let them believe I was weak, let them believe I was broken. Because the truth was, I was already making promises to myself, promises my son would never see coming. And that was just the beginning. I remember the last conversation we had before everything shattered, and the details replay in my mind with cruel clarity, as if every sound, every word, every flicker of expression on his face had been preserved for this very moment when I needed to understand just how little I meant to him. We were sitting at his dining table, the one I had helped him pay for years ago when he and his wife bought their first house, the polished surface gleaming under the light fixture I had installed myself, my hands still calloused from a lifetime of labor, and he leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest, his expression cool and impatient, as though the subject bored him before it even began. "Dad," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike, "we've been looking at the numbers, and this surgery is going to be extremely expensive. Tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more, and there's no guarantee you'll even get better after it. We have to be realistic here." I stared at him, the way his jaw tightened as he spoke, the way he avoided my eyes by glancing toward his wife, who sat beside him with her manicured nails tapping against a wine glass, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she already knew what verdict was coming. The smell of roasted chicken lingered faintly in the room, a meal I hadn't even been offered. Because I wasn't there to eat, I was there to be managed, to be told what would happen to me as if I were just another line item in their budget. "I'm not asking you for luxuries," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm asking for a chance to live. That's all, just a chance." He sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that carried annoyance more than empathy, and he leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the table in a restless rhythm. "It's not that simple, Dad. You don't understand the kind of financial pressure we're under. Between the kids' tuition, the mortgage, and everything else, we can't just throw money at something that might not even work. It wouldn't be responsible." Responsible. The word struck me like a slap because I had lived my entire life being responsible, sacrificing, working double shifts, patching roofs in the freezing cold, hauling lumber until my back gave out. Also, he could have the kind of life where the word responsible meant choosing between granite or quartz countertops instead of choosing between food or electricity. And here he was, using that word against me, as though denying me help was some kind of noble act, some higher calling of financial prudence. His wife finally spoke then, her voice smooth, practiced, as if she had been rehearsing the lines in her head. "We love you, of course, but you have to admit, it's selfish to expect us to put everything at risk for something that isn't guaranteed. You've lived a long life, and maybe it's time to accept that this is just nature taking its course." Nature taking its course. I felt the words lodge in my chest, heavier than any illness, and I looked at her, really looked, at the way her diamond earrings caught the light, at the way her hand rested casually on his arm, as though she were reminding him whose side he was on, and I realized she had won. She had convinced him that my years of sacrifice, my decades of effort, my entire existence could be reduced to an equation that no longer balanced in their favor. "I see," I said softly, because there was nothing else to say in that moment without breaking apart completely, and I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh finality that seemed to echo in the room. He shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing he had gone too far, perhaps sensing the weight of what he was doing, but instead of reaching out, instead of softening, he hardened further. "Don't make this dramatic, Dad," he said sharply. "We're just being practical. You'll be fine for now. Let's not overcomplicate things." Overcomplicate things. That's what my survival was to him, a complication. I nodded once, forcing my expression into a mask of calm, because I refused to let them see how deep the wound had cut, and I walked out of a house that I had once helped to make a home, the cold night air biting against my skin as I stepped into the darkness. The drive back to my small apartment was a blur, the headlights of passing cars streaking like ghosts across the windshield, and the silence inside the car felt suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, and every mile I drove was filled with memories of the countless sacrifices I had made for him, the hospital bills I had paid when he broke his arm as a teenager, the student loans I had shouldered so he could graduate without debt, the wedding expenses I had contributed to even when I barely had enough to cover my own rent. Every memory was a nail hammered into the coffin of the illusion I had carried, that he would one day repay love with love, sacrifice with gratitude. By the time I pulled into the cracked parking lot of my building, the anger had begun to burn away some of the numbness. I sat there in the car, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I whispered into the empty air, "If he thinks he can discard me like this, he doesn't know me at all." Inside my apartment, the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The heater rattled in the corner as it struggled against the winter chill, and I sat down heavily in the armchair by the window, staring out at the flickering streetlight. The betrayal still stung, but beneath it, something harder was forming, a resolve that grew sharper the longer I sat there. He believed I was powerless, that I had no choice but to accept his decision, but he had underestimated the strength of a man who had been underestimated his whole life. Because I wasn't done yet, not with living and not with him. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat in the darkness of my living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the pipes in the walls, and I let the silence press down on me like a weight I couldn't shake off. It felt almost fitting that the apartment was dark and cold, because I was carrying a darkness of my own now, heavier than anything I'd known in all my years of working and scraping and surviving. I thought about what my son had said at that table, how casually he had spoken about my life as though it were nothing more than a line in a ledger, and it kept replaying in my mind, looping endlessly, each repetition cutting deeper until it was almost unbearable. We had to be realistic. It wouldn't be responsible, nature taking its course. His voice carried the sharpness of someone convinced he was right, someone who thought compassion was an accessory to be worn only when convenient, and the cruelty of it struck me in waves. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, and I glanced around the room. The worn couch where I had sat so many evenings after long shifts, the coffee table nicked from years of use, the old armchair I bought secondhand when money was tight. All of it told the story of my life, a life of working hands and quiet sacrifice, of doing without so someone else could have more. And yet, standing in that modest room, surrounded by the evidence of my years of struggle, I couldn't escape the truth that none of it had mattered to him. I leaned back in the armchair and closed my eyes, and memories began to flood me, uninvited but unstoppable. I saw myself standing in the freezing rain the day he was born, rushing into the hospital with my boots soaked through because I had walked from the bus stop after working overtime, desperate not to miss the moment. I remembered the way he had wrapped his tiny hand around my finger, his grip so small and yet so strong, and how I had promised in that instant to give him everything I could. And I had. Year after year, I had given. I remember the nights I skipped dinner so he could have seconds, the mornings I woke before dawn to pick up extra work, the times I told him, "Don't worry, son, I'll take care of it," even when I didn't know how I would. I remembered the pride in his eyes when I bought him his first bicycle, the tears in mine when I signed the loan papers for his education, the way I had stood tall at his wedding even though I knew I couldn't afford the gift I wanted to give. Each memory was a knife. Each memory reminded me of the love I had poured into him, a love that had now been tossed aside like an old coat no longer worth wearing. And as the hours stretched on, the weight of that realization pressed harder and harder against my chest until it was difficult to breathe. At some point, I got up and shuffled into the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath my bare feet, and I poured myself a glass of water. The faucet squeaked as I turned off, and I stood there staring into the glass, the water trembling in my hand, and I thought about how easily life slips away. I thought about all the men I had worked with over the years, men who had given everything to their families and had died with nothing to show for it but calluses and debts. And I wondered if I was destined to be one of them, forgotten, abandoned, left to fade into the background of a life that had moved on without me. The tears came then, hot and unrelenting, and I sank down onto a chair at the kitchen table, burying my face in my hands. I cried not just for myself, but for the boy I had once held, the boy I had loved more than anything, the boy who had now grown into a man who looked at me as a burden instead of father. I cried for the years that had been stolen from me, for the sacrifices that had been erased from his memory, for the bond that had been broken beyond repair. But even in the midst of that sorrow, something else stirred beneath the surface. Anger. Not the kind of wild, uncontrolled anger that lashes out blindly, but a quieter, colder anger, the kind that simmers and builds, the kind that takes root and refuses to die. Because as much as it hurt to be discarded, I realized that I wasn't powerless, and I wasn't finished. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stared out the window, where the streetlight flickered weakly against the night sky. My reflection in the glass looked older, worn, tired, but there was something new there too, a sharpness in my eyes, a steel I hadn't seen before. He thought he could decide when my story ended, but that choice was mine and mine alone. I whispered into the quiet of the room, my voice low but steady. "You will regret this." The words surprised me with their certainty, but they felt true the moment they left my lips. He would regret underestimating me, regret thinking I had nothing left to give, regret treating me as disposable. The night stretched on, long and heavy, but I didn't feel the same kind of crushing despair I had felt earlier. Instead, I began to think, to plan, to piece together what needed to come next. The betrayal still stung. The sorrow still sat in my chest like a stone, but now it was mixed with resolve, and I knew that whatever time I had left, I wouldn't spend it begging for scraps of love or dignity. When dawn finally broke, the pale light spilling to the blinds, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The pain was still there, raw and deep, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it fueled me. And I knew, with a clarity sharper than anything I had felt in years, that this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. When the sun rose that morning, I didn't feel rested, but I felt awake in a way I hadn't for years. The ache in my bones was still there. The stiffness of age reminded me that time had marked me. But my mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in the endless haze of grief and betrayal that had consumed me the night before. I moved through the apartment slowly, almost mechanically, but every step carried the weight of a decision forming in the deepest part of me. I made coffee, the old machine sputtering as it brewed, and as the smell filled the kitchen, I sat down at the table with a notepad I hadn't touched in months. The lined paper looked almost foreign to me, as though it belonged to someone else, but I knew exactly what I needed for now. I started writing, not sentences, but numbers, years, events, cold, hard facts. 1979. That was the year I started my first full-time job after high school. 12-hour shifts in a factory that smelled of oil and metal. My hands blistered raw within the first week. I earned $2.25 an hour back then. I wrote it down. 1980. I remembered the day I signed a loan for his education. $42,000 spread out over years of monthly payments. I carried those papers home in a folder, terrified I wouldn't be able to keep up, but I did. I worked 2 jobs for stretches of time. There were months I couldn't afford my own new shoes, but he never went without. I wrote that down too. 1981, his first car. I paid half of it, $6,200 from my savings, because he insisted he couldn't commute otherwise. I didn't tell him I had taken the money from the account I had started for home repairs. That year the roof leaked for months before I could fix it. Another note on the page. 1982, his wedding. I gave him $10,000 as a gift, even though I only had $13,000 to my name at the time. I told him not to worry, that I wanted him to start his life right. That was the year I quietly canceled a vacation I had been planning for over a decade. One by one, I filled the page with numbers, sacrifices that had names and dates and real costs. It wasn't about the money alone. It was about proof, evidence that my life had been poured into his, piece by piece, until I had almost nothing left for myself. And now he had looked at me across that dinner table and said I wasn't worth saving. The anger that spread to me was not fiery and reckless, but cold and controlled, the kind of anger that sharpens a man rather than blinds him. For the first time, I stopped thinking of myself as a victim of his neglect and started thinking of myself as a man who still had choices. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into a drawer. It wasn't ready to be used yet, but I knew it would matter when the time came. Later that morning, I stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom, shaving carefully. My reflection stared back at me. Older, yes, with lines etched deep around my eyes and a face weathered by years of labor, but not defeated. Not yet. I thought of how he had looked at me, as though I were already gone, and I felt something harden inside of me. If he wanted me erased, forgotten, then I would do the opposite. I would make sure he remembered me in a way he couldn't escape. That night, after pacing the apartment for hours, I sat back down at the table and opened a folder where I kept my financial documents. My hands didn't shake as they had the night before. They were steady, deliberate, as I flipped through papers, my insurance, my savings, my accounts. He didn't know, because I had never spoken of it, but over the years I had managed to build something modest yet secure. It wasn't wealth that would make headlines, but it was enough. Enough to make a difference. Enough to hurt if taken away. I realized then that my story wasn't going to be about waiting for him to come around, waiting for some sudden change of heart that would never come. It was going to be about reclaiming what dignity I had left, about making sure he understood that betrayal has consequences. The resolve solidified inside me, and I remembered the words I had whispered into the darkness the night before. You'll regret this. Now, they weren't just words. They were a promise. In the days that followed, I carried myself differently. I no longer sat in the apartment, feeling like a man on the edge of disappearing. I went out. I walked to the park. I breathed in the crisp air, and with every step I told myself I wasn't done. I wasn't going to leave this world quietly, not on someone else's terms. I began making calls, quiet, private calls, to banks, to insurance companies, to lawyers. I spoke calmly, asked precise questions, moved pieces into place. Each conversation added to a growing sense of control. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drifting, like my life was something being dictated to me. I was dictating it. At night, though, the anger still returned. I would sit in my chair, staring at the shadows, and think of his words again, the casual cruelty of them, the way he had dismissed me with such certainty. And each time, I reminded myself of those numbers on the paper, the years of sacrifice that had led to this moment. He had taken my love, my labor, my money, my health, and he had given back nothing but indifference. That was when I stopped crying. The grief had drained out of me, replaced by something colder, sharper, more enduring. I wasn't a man he thought I was, weak and disposable. I was his father, and I was going to show him exactly what that meant. The first move wasn't dramatic, and that was intentional. I had no interest in shouting or pleading, or making emotional scenes that would give him the satisfaction of thinking I was weak. My revenge was going to be quiet, careful, and undeniable, like a tide that rises so slowly you don't notice until you're already drowning. I started with the simplest piece, my will. I hadn't looked at it in years, not since his mother passed. Back then, I thought it was natural to leave everything to him. Who else was there? But life had a cruel way of showing me that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and the past few weeks had made it crystal clear that he didn't see me as family anymore, only as a burden he wanted gone. So I called a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but the same one who had helped a friend of mine protect his estate when his children began circling like vultures. The lawyer remembered me, and when I explained what I wanted, he didn't hesitate. He asked questions, direct ones, about what I wanted my legacy to look like. And for the first time in years, I felt like someone was listening to me with respect. I don't want my son to inherit a cent, I said, my voice steady. Not 1 cent. He has made it clear that I mean nothing to him. And so I want him to receive nothing from me. I want everything I worked for, everything I've sacrificed, to go to people and places that actually value it. The lawyer didn't flinch. He simply nodded and began taking notes. We discussed options, charities, scholarships, even the possibility of setting up a small trust for grandchildren I barely saw. I wasn't sure yet where it would all go, but I knew one thing with certainty. My son would not be rewarded for his cruelty. When I left that office, walking with slow but firm steps, I felt a shift inside me. My hands had been steady as I signed the first documents. My voice hadn't cracked once. For the first time in a long time, I had done something not out of obligation, not out of desperation, but out of choice. It was a small strike, yes, but it was mine. The next step was harder, not because it was complicated, but because it was symbolic. For years, my son had access to certain accounts, not directly, but he knew of them. He knew that if he ever asked, I would reach in and pull out money for him, because that's what I had always done. When he needed a down payment, I gave it. When he wanted help with his first business venture, I co-signed the loan. He had grown so accustomed to my support that he assumed it would always be there, like water from a faucet. But those days were over. I went to the bank on a gray Tuesday morning, carrying a worn leather folder that held every account statement, every savings certificate, every policy number I still had. The teller recognized me. I'd been coming there for decades, and she smiled politely, but when I told her I needed to make significant changes, her expression grew serious. She led me to a private office where a manager listened carefully as I explained. I want to consolidate everything, I said. New accounts, new access codes, new beneficiaries. My son is not to be associated with any of it. Remove his name, remove his access, remove every connection. It took hours. Papers to sign, questions to answer, decisions to finalize. But when I walked out of that bank, every tie that connected him to my financial life had been cut. If he came looking for the easy path, for the man who had always bailed him out, he would find nothing. That night, as I sat in my chair by the window, I looked out at the city lights and felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. My heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from resolve. He thought he had reduced me to nothing, that I was a man just waiting for death. But what he didn't realize was that a man with nothing to lose can be the most dangerous kind of man. I kept going. I called the insurance company and adjusted my policies. I called the utility companies and changed account information he still had access to from years ago. Every call was another piece of my life reclaimed, another rope untied from the anchor that had been dragging me down. And with each step, I grew calmer. I wasn't doing this in a rush of emotion. I wasn't flailing. I was steady, methodical, deliberate. This wasn't about rage. It was about justice. But revenge isn't only about paperwork. It's about preparation, about making sure that when the moment comes, the blow lands with maximum force. And so as I crossed tasks off my list, I began something else, a diary of sorts, but not for myself, for him. Each night, I wrote down the sacrifices, the years, the dollars, the sleepless nights, the promises made and kept. I wrote down every moment where I had chosen him over myself. Page after page, I built a record, a ledger of love and sacrifice that he had chosen to spit on. I didn't know yet when I would show it to him, but I knew that one day he would read it. He would see in black and white what he had thrown away. And perhaps the cruelest part of my revenge was that I didn't want him to simply lose money. I wanted him to understand, to feel the weight of his betrayal, because money can be replaced, but shame can burn a man forever. As the days turned into weeks, I felt myself becoming someone different, not the broken man who sat weeping after being told he wasn't worth saving, not the desperate father still hoping for scraps of affection. I was something steadier, colder, more certain. I was a man who had taken back the reins of his life. And though I hadn't revealed it yet, I knew in my bones the first act was complete. The foundation had been laid. My son's safety net was gone, his expectations severed, his inheritance erased. All that remained was the moment he would discover it. And when that day came, he would realize too late that the man he dismissed as disposable had been quietly rewriting the ending all along. It didn't take long before he noticed. A man like my son, who had grown used to easy money flowing his way, could sense the moment a faucet turned dry. The first call came on a Thursday afternoon, his number flashing on my phone. For a brief moment, my heart clenched the way it always used to when I saw his name, hope flaring, old instincts tugging. But I forced myself to answer with a steady voice. "Dad," he said, his tone sharp, too sharp, like a man already angry. "What's going on with the accounts? I tried to make a transfer, and it didn't go through. Did you change something?" I let silence hang in the air longer than he liked, then said, "Yes, I made some changes." "Why?" He didn't even bother to hide the irritation. "You know I need access. We got bills, projects, things that can't wait. Why would you mess with that?" Because I was tired of being nothing more than a wallet with a pulse, I thought. But what I said was, because it was time. That simple answer set him off. He launched into a familiar monologue about loyalty, about family responsibility, about how everything I had was because of him somehow. It was the same twisted logic he'd always used, that my sacrifices were debts, not gifts. But as his words spilled out, I felt something remarkable. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. When he finally paused, I said calmly, "Those accounts are mine, and I'll decide how they're used." The silence on the other end was heavy, almost crackling, before he spat out, "Unbelievable. After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me?" Then he hung up. I didn't shake after the call. That in itself felt like a victory. But he wasn't done. The next few days were a barrage. First, the guilt. He called again, softer this time, almost rehearsed. "Dad, look." I didn't mean to sound harsh. We're under a lot of stress. You know how hard it is raising kids, keeping up with the mortgage, the car payments. You've always been there for us. We can't do this without you." His voice was almost convincing, and if this had been a year ago, I might have cracked. But now, I heard it for what it was, manipulation wrapped in sentiment. I told him, "You can do it without me? You should. You're a grown man." That ended the call quickly. Then came the anger. Furious voicemails, long texts filled with accusations. He said I was selfish, cruel, abandoning my own family. He said people would hear about what I was doing, that the neighborhood, the church, everyone would know what kind of man I really was. And sure enough, whispers began. A neighbor mentioned offhandedly that my son had said I was losing my mind. Another called to check in, asking if I was confused about my finances, if maybe I needed help managing things. I knew where it was coming from. My son was laying the groundwork, painting me as unstable, hoping to shame me into backing down. But he didn't understand something. Once a man has been abandoned in a hospital bed, told his life isn't worth saving, public gossip loses its sting. I had already been humiliated in the most intimate way possible. There was nothing left for him to take from me in that regard, so I stayed calm. I answered questions with a smile. "I appreciate your concern," I told the neighbors. "I assure you, I'm in full control of my affairs." And I made sure they saw the steadiness in my eyes, the firmness in my voice. The lies slid off me like water on stone. That only seemed to make him angrier. The next escalation came in the form of a letter, thick and official-looking, delivered right to my door. He had hired a lawyer. At least, that's what he wanted me to believe. The letter accused me of being unfit, of making irrational changes to my estate, and hinted at possible legal action to challenge my decisions. I read it slowly, every word, and then I set it aside. I called my own lawyer, who laughed softly when I described it. "This isn't a real case," he said. "It's a scare tactic. He has no grounds. You're of sound mind, and your choices are clear. Don't be intimidated." And I wasn't. For the first time, I realized the tables had turned. He was scrambling now, trying every angle, guilt, anger, shame, intimidation, because he felt the ground shifting beneath him. The father he had dismissed as weak was no longer bending to his will. One evening, he showed up in person. He hadn't done that in years. He didn't even knock, just stormed in with the same entitled energy he'd carried since he was a boy. His face was red, his words sharp. "You can't do this," he shouted. "You can't just cut me out like I'm nothing. I'm your son." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a son but a man who had grown fat on my sacrifices, who had mistaken kindness for obligation. I stood slowly, my body weaker than it once was, but my spine straight as ever. "I can," I said quietly, "and I already have." The silence after that was louder than his shouting. He stared at me, mouth open, as if he couldn't process the words. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. I sat back down, my heart steady, my hands still. He thought he could break me with fury, with shame, with threats. But all he had done was confirm that I was winning, because a man who is truly in control does not scream. A man who feels secure does not threaten. He was unraveling, and I was calm. And in that calm, I found something stronger than anger. I found satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that comes not from yelling back, not from trading blow for blow, but from watching a man who thought he held all the power realize it has slipped through his fingers. The retaliation phase was supposed to scare me back into line. Instead, it only proved that the line had been broken for good. He had tried everything, and none of it worked. And that meant only one thing. The final act was near. The stage was set, and the strike that would end this once and for all was waiting. The day of reckoning came on Christmas, though the irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Christmas had been the one day when I would set aside the bitterness, when I'd push down the loneliness and hope my son might call, even if just to toss me a bone of seasonal charity. Most years he didn't. The house would be quiet, the phone silent, and I'd eat a small meal by myself, staring at the lights on a tree that looked less magical with each passing season. But this year was different. This year he invited me, not because he missed me, not because he loved me, because he thought I was useful again, because money was now in the equation. I accepted, though not for the reasons he imagined. He thought I was walking into his home to be folded back under his thumb. He didn't know I was walking in with every piece already arranged, every step already planned. The moment I walked into his house, I could feel the performance. His wife greeted me with a smile too wide, the kind you use when company comes you don't really like. The decorations were extravagant, overdone, as if they needed to prove something to the world. And my son? He hugged me quickly, already turning to the guests, projecting the image of a generous man who had welcomed his estranged father home. "Everyone," he said, glass in hand, his voice carrying across the room. "This is my father. After all these years, he's back with us. Family is everything, right?" The room applauded politely, but I could see the glances. I could hear the whispers. He had spent weeks telling them I was unstable, unreliable, maybe even senile. And now, he paraded me in front of them, the poor old man returning to the fold. It was a performance for their benefit, but also for mine. He wanted me to know he still thought he held the power. Dinner was served, and I sat quietly, listening more than speaking. Every few minutes, the conversation circled back to me, or rather, to my money, subtle at first. His wife asked if I still had the vacation property. His brother-in-law wondered aloud if I'd ever considered family investments. My son sprinkled in comments about how things will be easier now that Dad's here. They didn't even bother to hide it. It wasn't a reunion. It was a negotiation, and I was supposed to be the prize on the table. Finally, when dessert was cleared, my son stood. He tapped his glass, smiling like a man who thought he had already won. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, "to new beginnings, to second chances, to the future." Then he raised his glass to me, and to my father, who's promised to take care of this family, just like he always has. We couldn't be more grateful. The room erupted in applause. Glasses clinked. Heads nodded. But I didn't raise my glass. I didn't smile. I simply looked at him. Long enough for the applause to quiet. Long enough for the room to sense the shift. When it was finally still, I said, "That's not true." You could have heard a pin drop. "What do you mean, Dad?" My son's smile faltered. Just a little. "I mean," I said, my voice steady, "that I haven't promised you anything. Not a cent. Not a house. Not a car. Not a single dollar." Gasps rippled through the room. His wife's mouth fell open. His in-laws exchanged nervous glances. My son turned red, then pale, then red again. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, trying to laugh it off. "Of course you did. We talked about this." "No," I interrupted. "You talked. You assumed. And you lied. To me. To everyone here." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the papers I brought. My lawyer had suggested it, and I was glad he had. I unfolded them slowly, letting the suspense build. These are the documents proving exactly where my money is going. Every property, every account, every investment. It's all secured. Not for you, not for this family. I looked directly at his children, who sat wide-eyed at the table. It's for the grandchildren, and for charities that actually care about people like me, who know what it means to be left behind. The silence was deafening. My son tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He stammered something about betrayal, about family, about me being manipulated by outsiders. But the room wasn't with him anymore. The guests looked at him differently now, seeing the mask slip, seeing the greed exposed. His wife's face twisted with embarrassment, her parents shifting uncomfortably in their seats. You said I was unstable. I continued, my voice rising just enough. You told people I didn't know what I was doing. You spread lies because you were afraid of exactly this moment. But let me make it clear. I am more in control now than I have ever been, and I will never let you use me again. I set the papers down on the table, right in front of him, and leaned back in my chair. So raise your glass if you like. Toast to your future. But it won't be built on my back anymore. The room stayed frozen for several long seconds, no one daring to move, until finally, when the grandchildren lifted her glass hesitantly and whispered, "To Grandpa." The sound cracked the tension, and soon the other grandchildren echoed her, "To Grandpa." Their little voices carried more weight than the clinking of 100 glasses. I raised my glass to them, and only to them, and drank. My son stood there, humiliated, powerless, his face flushed with a fury he could no longer disguise. For once, he had no control over the story. For once, the truth had slipped past his carefully crafted performance. And for me, the moment was sweeter than any revenge I could have imagined, not because I had destroyed him, but because I had freed myself. That night, as I walked out into the cold winter air, I felt lighter than I had in decades. For 20 years, I had carried the weight of his rejection, his silence, his cruelty. Now I carried nothing. He was the one left with the emptiness. When I stepped outside into the winter night, the sound of laughter and chatter from the house faded quickly, replaced by the crisp silence of falling snow. The cold hit my face in sharp bursts, but instead of shivering, I found myself breathing deeper, slower, as if the air had been cleansed somehow, as if the world was finally allowing me to take in a full breath without the weight pressing on my chest. I had walked out of many doors in my life, but this one was different. This wasn't just leaving a dinner. This was leaving behind decades of guilt, manipulation, and rejection that had chained me to a son who never really wanted me unless I could be useful to him. I paused at the end of the driveway, looking back at the house, glowing warm and golden through the windows. From this distance, it could have been mistaken for a picture of happiness. A family gathered around, food on the table, gifts under the tree. But I knew the truth of what had just happened inside. Behind those glowing windows, my son's world had cracked. His mask had slipped. The performance he had carefully crafted had been exposed for what it was. Greed dressed as love, manipulation disguised as reconciliation. And for once, I wasn't the one walking away empty-handed. I had my dignity. I had my freedom. I had, at long last, the ability to live the rest of my life without begging for his approval, without twisting myself into knots just to earn a smile that was never real. As I walked to my car, I thought about the years that had led to this. All those Christmases spent alone, waiting for a phone call that never came. All those times I told myself, maybe next year he'll remember. Maybe next year he'll want me around. I had clung to that hope like a drowning man clings to driftwood, even as it splintered in my hands. And yet, standing there now, keys cold in my palm, I realized how much time I had wasted on someone who had already made his choice 20 years ago. It wasn't that he couldn't love me. It was that he wouldn't. Inside the car, the seat creaked softly under me as I sank back, letting the heater roar to life. I gripped the steering wheel and closed my eyes. For a moment, images flooded back. Him as a child, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair, his small hands clutching my head, his laughter ringing out in the summer air. I remembered staying up nights to fix his bike when he crashed it, remembered pulling double shifts just so He could have the sneakers all the other kids wore. Those memories still had weight, but they no longer had power over me. They were the past, and the man who had just stood at that table, lying to everyone around him, was not the boy I had raised. I started the car and pulled out of the driveway slowly, the tires crunching against a thin sheet of ice. As the house grew smaller in the rear-view mirror, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Relief, not sadness, not longing, not the ache of rejection. Relief. The road stretched before me, empty, the snowflakes catching in the headlights like tiny sparks. For once, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt earned. It felt peaceful. In the days that followed, I didn't hear from my son. No angry calls, no desperate texts, no attempts to spin the story. Maybe he was too embarrassed. Maybe he realized he couldn't twist this one back in his favor. Whatever the reason, the silence was welcome. I had lived through his silence before, but this time it wasn't him shutting me out. It was me choosing not to let him back in. Instead, I heard from others. A letter from one of the grandchildren, written in clumsy handwriting, thanking me for standing up for myself. A call from an old friend who had heard what happened and said, "About time you stopped letting him walk all over you." Even the lawyer, usually so dry and businesslike, told me, "I don't often say this, but I admire how you handled it." For the first time in years, I felt like people saw me clearly, not as the old man who had been discarded by his own blood, but as someone who had found his strength again. I spent more time with the grandchildren in the weeks that followed. I took them to the park, bought them ice cream, listened to them chatter about school and friends. They didn't care about bank accounts or property lines. They cared that I showed up, that I was there, and in their laughter, I found a new kind of healing. My son had tried to erase me from his life for 20 years, but he couldn't erase me from theirs. As the months rolled by, I invested more of my time and resources into things that mattered. I donated to organizations that helped elderly people who had no families to turn to. I started volunteering once a week at a local shelter, talking with men and women whose children had also abandoned them. Their stories mirrored mine, sometimes eerily so, and together we found comfort in knowing we weren't alone. And the money? It remained untouchable by my son, every cent locked away, secured in trust for the grandchildren and causes that deserved it. Every time I looked at those papers, I felt a rush of satisfaction, knowing that all the years of sacrifice wouldn't be wasted on someone who had only ever seen me as a wallet. There were still nights when the ache returned, when I lay awake thinking about how different things could have been if he had chosen love over greed. But even on those nights, I reminded myself I had done my part. I had given him everything a father could. It was his choice to throw it away. And now, finally, I had chosen myself. I didn't know how many Christmases I had left, but I knew one thing for certain. Not a single one would be wasted hoping for his approval again. I would spend them surrounded by the people who wanted me, who valued me, even if that circle was smaller than I had once imagined. In the end, it wasn't about revenge in the way people usually think of it. It wasn't about destroying him. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my peace. And that, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all. The spring thaw came early that year, the snow melting into slick rivers along the sidewalks, the bare branches stretching as if they, too, were ready to breathe again. I hadn't planned to attend the family gathering in town. Truthfully, I had thought about ignoring the invitation when one of my daughter-in-law's cousins sent it, insisting that it would mean a lot to the kids if he showed up. For weeks, I wrestled with the thought. My son would be there, of course. And part of me wondered if walking into that room would undo all the progress I had made since Christmas. But in the end, it wasn't him I wanted to see. It was the grandchildren. It was the people who had stood by me when the truth spilled out into the open. When I arrived, the hall was already buzzing. Long tables lined with dishes, children darting between the chairs, and clusters of adults with glasses in hand, talking in low murmurs. I noticed quickly how I shifted when I stepped inside. Some people smiled warmly. Others looked away, pretending not to see me, but I could feel the current ripple through the room. He's here. And then I saw him, my son, standing tall near the center table, his arm around his wife, his expression tight the moment his gaze met mine. For a second, it was as if time folded back, as if we were once again locked in that moment at the Christmas table. Only this time, there were no gifts stacked behind him, no false pleasantries softening the air, only the stark recognition that he no longer had the same control he once wielded over me. I walked slowly, deliberately, offering nods to those who acknowledged me. My cane tapped against the wood floor, steady, rhythmic, the sound louder than the chatter in my ears. When I reached the table, my son opened his mouth, perhaps to stop me, perhaps to turn me away like he had done for 2 decades. But before he could, another voice rang out. "Grandpa's here!" One of the little ones cried, rushing forward to wrap their arms around my waist. The room shifted again, the tension breaking as the children crowded me, tugging at my hand, pulling me toward the table. I sat down with them, ignoring the way my son's jaw tightened, ignoring the way his wife's hand gripped his sleeve. For once, I wasn't there on his terms. I was there on mine. As the evening went on, I could feel whispers stirring. The story of what had happened at Christmas had spread. Not because I told it, but because he couldn't contain it. Pride and greed leave cracks, and in those cracks, the truth seeps through. People asked quiet questions, offered sympathetic glances. Some avoided me altogether, perhaps afraid to choose sides. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized something important. His power over me had dissolved not just in my heart, but in the eyes of others too. And then, as if fate had been waiting, the organizer of the event tapped her glass and asked me to say a few words. I could see the panic flash in my son's eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me to stand, to speak, to claim space in front of everyone. I rose slowly, letting the cane support me, and turned to face the crowd. For a moment, I simply looked at them, the faces I had known for years, the younger ones just beginning to shape their place in the family. My son stood stiff in the back, his expression a mask. I wasn't sure I'd come tonight. I began, my voice low but steady. Not after everything that's happened this past year. Some of you know the story. Some of you don't. But I think you all deserve to hear one truth from me, and not through the whispers or the half-told versions that float around these rooms. The hall fell silent. I could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the faint shuffle of a chair in the corner, the heartbeat in my chest pressing against my ribs. For 20 years, I lived with silence. I continued, not the kind of silence you choose for peace, but the kind forced upon you when your own blood turns away. My son, I paused, watching the ripple move through the room. My son decided long ago that I wasn't worth his time, until money was involved, until I had something he wanted. I saw his wife's face blanch, saw him shift uncomfortably, but I didn't stop. I don't stand here to shame anyone. I stand here because I want the truth to be clear. Family is not a business transaction. Love is not measured in dollars. And if you invite someone back into your life only because of what they can give you, that is not reconciliation. That is manipulation. That is cruelty. And I will not live the rest of my days pretending otherwise. The silence stretched heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable for me. Not anymore. I had carried the discomfort for too long, and tonight I laid it down. I let my eyes drift to the grandchildren, who were sitting wide-eyed, their forks frozen mid-air. But here's what I will say. Even when blood disappoints you, even when those closest to you fail, there can still be love. There can still be connection. I see it in these children. I see it in the friends who reached out when I needed it most. I see it in the faces of those who reminded me I wasn't alone. I lower myself back into the chair, feeling the rush of air leave my lungs, as though I had been holding it all these years. A murmur spread through the room, some people nodding, others whispering. My son stood motionless, his face pale, unable to regain the grip he once had. In that moment, I didn't need revenge in the form of shouting or confrontation. The truth had done the work for me. His image, his story, his carefully constructed mask had cracked in front of the very people he wanted to impress. And I, the man he had abandoned, had not only survived but stood stronger, clearer, freer than ever. When the evening ended, I walked out into the cool air again. The night sky stretched wide above me, and for the first time in decades, I didn't look back. The weeks after that family gathering passed in a way that surprised me. I had expected to feel drained, hollow, maybe even ashamed of speaking so openly, but instead, a strange calm settled into me. For the first time in years, my shoulders didn't ache from carrying words unsaid. There was no knot twisting in my chest every time the phone rang, wondering if it would be another demand, another veiled threat, another reminder that I was only seen as a wallet and not a father. I woke up each morning to quiet light pouring through my kitchen window, made myself a simple breakfast, and found comfort in routines I had nearly abandoned. I noticed how silence had changed. Before, it had been suffocating, a reminder of the absence of voices I longed to hear. But now, silence had become a companion. It was no longer empty. It was full of choice. My choice. The hospital bills had long since been paid, not by him, but by me, by the careful planning I had done in the years he wasn't around, by the trust I had put in myself when no one else was willing to stand by me. That I realized was the greatest lesson betrayal had handed me. When everything is stripped away, when even family closes its doors, the only person left standing in your corner is yourself. And if you don't honor that, no one else will. Neighbors began to visit more often. One older gentleman from down the street would stop by to share stories about his late wife. A widow from church would sometimes bring soup or bread. They didn't come because they wanted something from me. They came because human kindness is real, and it exists outside the walls of greed and manipulation. That was something I had nearly forgotten. And each visit reminded me of what I still had, even after everything I had lost. I wasn't naive. I knew my son still spun his version of the story. People told me he muttered about how I had humiliated him, how I had twisted the narrative. But the truth had a way of planting itself in people's minds, and the cracks in his story widened no matter how hard he tried to patch them. He couldn't erase the memory of me standing in that hall, cane in hand, steady voice carrying through the room. He couldn't take away the way eyes had shifted that night, how whispers had turned against him instead of me. That loss of control was his undoing, not mine. One afternoon, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, I thought about legacy, not in the grand sense of wealth or reputation, but in the simple sense of what remains when you're gone. For years, I had feared that mine would be defined by silence, by being the father cast aside, the man left behind, the one remembered only for the wounds inflicted on him. But now, I realize legacy is not what others decide for you. It is what you decide for yourself, in the choices you make, in the boundaries you draw, in the dignity you refuse to surrender. That Christmas night, when he asked me to disappear, had nearly broken me. But standing there in that hall weeks later, reclaiming my voice, had rebuilt me, not into the man I once was, but into someone stronger, someone who understood that revenge doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like standing tall in truth, unflinching, while the other person crumbles under the weight of their own lies. I thought back to when he was a child. There had been days when I carried him on my shoulders, when I taught him to ride a bike, when I worked long hours to keep food on the table, so his birthdays were filled with more than just cake. Those memories were still real, and they still belonged to me, but they were no longer shackles. I didn't cling to them hoping they would erase the cruelty of later years. I accepted them as part of the whole picture, the good, the bad, the devastating, and the redemptive. In the spring, I decided to do something I had been putting off. I rewrote my will. I sat with my lawyer and made it clear. Nothing would pass into the hands of those who had abandoned me. Instead, I set up small funds for the grandchildren's education. I left portions to the church, to a local shelter, to causes that had meaning beyond the shallow grasp of greed. And when I signed my name at the bottom of those papers, I felt the pen steady in my hand, a quiet triumph that no one could take from me. The lawyer looked at me over his glasses and said, "Are you certain? Families can be complicated." I smiled, a weary smile, but one filled with resolve. Families can be complicated, yes, but blood alone doesn't define legacy. Character does, and I won't reward betrayal. Walking out of that office, papers neatly tucked under my arm, I realized that true revenge wasn't just in taking away what he expected to inherit. It was in living fully, without fear, without silence, without bending to his shadow anymore. The revenge was in showing that his cruelty had not destroyed me, that his abandonment had not erased me. The revenge was survival, dignity, and peace. Weeks later, I found myself sitting in the park, watching the children play, the sunlight catching in their hair, their laughter carrying across the grass. One of the grandchildren spotted me and came running, calling Grandpa, loud enough to turn heads. And in that moment, I understood love finds its way through the cracks, even when betrayal tries to choke it out. The bonds that mattered had survived, and the ones that didn't had withered on their own. I sat back on the bench, breathing deeply, the air crisp and alive in my lungs. The hospital bed, the cold rejection, the 20 years of silence, all of it had brought me here, to a place where I could sit in the sun, unafraid, unbroken, and undeniably free. And as I watched the little ones race across the grass, I whispered quietly to myself, that's the ending. That's the story I choose.